Everyone, welcome aboard for today's Tech Tuesdays webinar on pairing MDM and data governance in necessary and complementary match. I'm Brinda, your host for today's webinar. Today we have Lisa Morris as a presenter for the session, who is a senior principal from the Informatica Professional Services team. Before we start this webinar, let's go through some housekeeping tips. The duration of the entire session is for 1 hour, including the 15 minutes Q&A. You can post your queries in the Q&A box. Dial-in participants will be muted throughout. The session is being recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success Portal. You'll also be able to download the slide deck from the Success Portal website. Please feel free to put in your feedbacks and suggestions for the session in the post-webinar survey. The Tech Tuesdays webinars are hosted within the Success Portal, which is a micro-learning platform that offers free and unlimited learning to all registered users. This feature-rich platform was launched to help you learn and use Informatica products better. Here are a few important links that you can go over later that will help you in your product adoption journey with Informatica. Over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
Welcome to our data governance and MDM participants. Today's seminar is going to talk about data governance for MDM requirements discovery. Our agenda for today is to talk about data governance, pairing it with our master data management initiatives, look at the MDM requirements that we need to gather, and then map those requirements to the facets in our data governance tool, and then take a look at how we can take advantage of workflows to document what we've decided in our MDM requirements, so it makes it easier to find things in the future, and take a look at the accelerators that are available for Axon in order to do data governance with our Customer 360 data model. And then we'll do a demo of Axon and the data governance tool, capturing these requirements, and then leave some time for Q&A. So for years, we've known that data governance is critical to achieving sustainable and effective MDM. Failure to execute data governance concurrently with an MDM program greatly decreases the probability of success and economic sustainability of the MDM program. And not only is this a quote from the MDM Institute from a number of years ago, but I've also experienced this in my 35 years in the IT industry, 20 of those in the last in the MDM and data governance arena. I've worked on projects at companies where we've tried to do data governance by itself and it's fallen over. We've tried to do MDM by itself and it's fallen over. And on our third try, when we did MDM with data governance together, that's when we were successful. So the requirements that we're going to be gathering during for our MDM system are the following. We need to identify the business domains that we want to master and the fields that we want to master based on the MDM 360 data model. We want to update that out-of-the-box MDM 360 data model to identify items that we don't want to use based on the way our company does business, or things that we need to add based on the way our company does business. So we can add tables, we can add different attributes to existing tables, or add whole new tables if we need to. The third step is to identify source systems that feed the above defined data into MDM for mastering and do our source to target mapping with it. Then we want to identify the data quality and transformation rules that we're going to use as we feed that source information into our MDM system. And as well, we want to identify the reference data that we're going to be using with those business definitions and those data quality rules. So we all know that reference data is a large part of master data management, making sure that things fall into certain categories, certain lists, and things like that using our data quality rules. After that, we want to identify our match rules and our trust scores. So our match rules that say these are the combination of attributes that we're going to use to match on, and whether we want fuzzy or exact matches with different combinations of those. And then our trust scores to say I trust the information from this system more than the next system, or maybe it's just one or two attributes from the first system that are better than the second or third system, or maybe the attributes in the third system are better than the first or second system. So we want to set up those trust scores rules as well. Then we want to identify the householding and other relationships that we want to create in our MDM system such as family households of, parents and children and grandparents, or maybe it's more of a business to consumer relationship. So we have, individual investors and their financial representatives that are helping to counsel them. The next thing we want to do is identify the systems and integration techniques for consuming the mastered records once we have everything mastered and we have the best record possible to share with those downstream systems for reporting and analytics, and also to share with third-party vendors that we might use to help us with our processes. If we are using third-party vendors and sharing information with them, we want to make sure that we also identify the data sharing agreements with them. And even for internal shares, we want to identify the masking rules and other privacy policies and security measures that might be needed as we're sharing that information out of the MDM system. So let's take a look at the Customer 360 data model next. The data model follows the party model, which is similar to our multi-domain MDM model as well. Okay, and in this party model, both persons and organizations are considered to be parties. They're distinguished by their roles as a person or a party. So persons can be customers or clients or members. They could also be employees, contractors, or volunteers. Organizations could be other subsidiaries of your company. They could be vendors, they could be supplier organizations, or they could even be external regulators or governmental regulators. Both persons and organizations have fields in common, such as they have addresses, they have phone numbers, they have electronic addresses, such as emails or websites. They have tax information that might be applied to both of them that might be of interest in our processing, etc. So the differences, though, between persons and organizations are persons have first names, last names, and middle names. So a person name actually breaks down into 3 separate attributes, first, middle, and last name, whereas organizations typically just have a business name, but they can have different business names, such as incorporation names, doing business as names, legal names, and so on. Persons and organizations have relationships with each other. So as we discussed in our agenda overview, the households are the person-to-person relationships, so family members that are grouped together for a purpose. We also have organization-to-organization relationships, or those B2B relationships. And then we also have organization-to-person relationships. So those would be considered business-to-consumer or B2C relationships. When we do our requirements, we're going to translate those into our data governance tool into the following facets. So those business definitions of those data domains or data subjects, the fields and attributes or the elements in those data subjects, and the reference data, those will all become glossary items. The collection of those data, such as tables, reports, and physical files, those will become data sets in our data governance tool. Within those data sets, we'll have the attributes, the actual column names or the attributes of those tables, the reports or the files. We also want to define our data quality and data transformation rules. So as we're moving the data from our source systems to our MDM system, we want to be able to apply these quality rules and standardize the information to make it a best as possible situation to have a match on the data. As we move the data from those source systems to the MDM system, we want to know what the source systems are, and then downstream, once we've identified the mastered records, we want to identify the consuming systems, the consuming databases internally, the reporting and analytics warehouses that the information is going to, and then also the systems of our third-party vendors that we're going to be sending our information to. As we all know, systems send data from one to another. We want to trace that through our interfaces. So the interfaces are the integration patterns for moving the data from the source systems to the MDM system, or from those mastered records in the MDM systems to those consuming systems. The policies are going to be our match rules and our trust scores, but not only those for MDM. Again, because we're going to be sharing that information, We also want to create policies for those data sharing agreements with our third parties, and then our privacy tags, security measures, record retention rules, and so on. All of those policies, all of those things will be identified as policies in our data governance tool and attached to either the systems, the legal entities, or the third parties, or the data glossary items themselves. As we share the information with our internal departments that own the systems, the data, and policies, we'll identify those as business areas in our data governance tool. And then the external third parties that the data is obtained from or shared with, those will be legal entities in our data governance tool. Along with the legal entities, a number of the privacy regulations also are very, very interested in where the data is being shared as well. And so we'll attach geographies of those third-party legal entities to show where that data is being transferred to. And then we'll also try and identify where the data lives at rest, not only with those third parties, but also internally as we move our data from one country to another. Maybe we have an operations center in a third country. And so we need to be able to identify where that data is being transferred to, not only internally, but also externally. So all of these different facets have relationships with each other. And as you can see here in this relationship diagram, the purple items are the glossary items. So we'll start off with our party hierarchy. We'll break that down into persons, organizations, addresses, emails. You can see that address breaks down into line 1, line 2, city, state, zip. And then we can also see that the state glossary item refers to a state reference table, so state codes reference table. So we'll see some glossary to glossary relationships that way, as well as some parent-child relationships in our party model. The dark blue items are different policies. So we'll have personal information policies attached to our persons. We might have record retention policies attached to our systems. If our record retention is based on the type of person, we may associate that record retention policy back to the glossary item as well. We can see our match rules and our trust rules associated with our MDM system. And then our data sharing policies down here at the bottom are shared with the legal entities, attached to the legal entities. We can also see that our glossary items break down into physical data sets and physical attributes within those data sets. So in this example here, I'm showing 2 data sets within our MDM system that break down into each one of them having an address line 1 that would then be attached to our address line 1 business definition. So our business definitions are a one-to-many relationship. The business definitions define how the business views that item, and then the data sets and attributes show us the multiple systems that definition manifests itself in the physical world. And so we'll see multiple data sets and multiple attributes attached to a single glossary item. Our MDM system is going to receive information from source systems, and it's going to do that through an interface. And so we'll document those interfaces in pink and those systems in orange on this diagram. Those systems and interfaces could be owned by different internal departments. So perhaps our customer care area owns one of the source systems, and maybe the loan department owns another source system. And that's going to get fed into our MDM system through the pink interfaces. And then once we've mastered the data, we'll have additional interfaces that will then share that with our internal consuming systems and our external consuming systems. Again, we're going to associate those internal systems with the departments that are responsible for them. So in this case, maybe a collections department. And then our external consuming systems, maybe part of that loan process is to go off and get a credit report. So we're going to share that master data with Equifax or a credit reporting company to aid in our loan processing process. Okay. With the legal entity, the third party, the Equifax that we've associated here with the external consumer system, okay, again, we want to identify the geography of where that data is being shared with, and then also that data sharing agreement. So our first step is to identify those business domains that we want to master and the fields that we want within those domains, those data subjects, based on the MDM 360 data model. So we have an Axon Accelerator that will load the entire MDM 360 data model into your Axon Data Governance instance and give you a hierarchy of the party that's related then to persons and organizations, and the party will hold the address, and the address will have its elements. It'll hold things like email and phone information and a lot of other information, and we'll see that when we do the demo of this hierarchy in the Axon instance. Each one of these glossary items has a stakeholder or a data owner that's going to be owning the data, or they could have also a data steward or a data curator that's going to help to maintain this information. Okay. By using these glossary items and then starting a workflow process to socialize those items and the decisions that you've made around those items, you can start a workflow process in Axon, and that allows you to refer back to that documentation as the definitions are challenged, revisited, and changed over time. And so the benefit of doing this is that you don't have to go searching through past emails, meeting minutes, spreadsheets where you've documented decisions to find those historical revisions to the definitions and the approved definitions. It's all right there in the Axon workflow history. Okay, and these workflows can be done on any one of the facets, not just the glossary facet. But the glossary facet is typically where the most discussion happens. You know, do we need it? Do we not need it? Do we want to call it this? Do we not want to call it that? You know, how come we didn't call it this? Well, we look in history and we see that 3 revisions ago it was called that, but then we decided to change it. So there's a lot of back and forth that goes on with the glossary definitions of the business domains in our MDM model. The next step is to update that out-of-the-box model with those changes in the names, but then also a lot of times we need to add additional tables or additional attributes to the existing tables. And so we would update those, the out-of-the-box MDM 360 data model in our data governance instance, again, as we are adding things, either tables or new attributes. Those definitions would then be documented in the data governance tool. We would start a workflow process to gain the approval and have all of that approval or disapproval or discussion documented in that workflow discussion. If we wanted to not use something that was already in the 360 data model, we could then go in and mark it as deleted. Again, making sure that we do the workflow process to make sure everyone agrees that we don't want it and we actually do want to delete it before it's actually deleted. We would keep that documentation in our Axon model, again, for that historical reference, but then ask our MDM data modeler to physically remove that item from the data model, or just mark it as not used in the data model, the physical data model. The next step then, after we've identified what data we want in our MDM system, is to then identify the source systems that feed MDM for the mastering. Okay, so we would use the system facet along with the interface facet in order to show what the source systems are and then what the interface is that we're going to use to feed that information to our MDM system. The interfaces are typically daily MDM ETL jobs. But they could be something other than daily, and they could be something other than ETL jobs. And so some of that information can be then designed with the IT team as to how we're going to move the data from the source systems to the MDM system. And again, by designing it and documenting it in Axon, starting the workflow process to have that approved by all the people that are involved in that, and make sure that we document their approval and the discussion that happens around that. The fourth step is to identify the data quality and transformation rules that we're going to apply as we move that data from the source systems to the MDM system. So again, our best practice here is to use a data quality facet to capture that business rules and then transform those rules into actual technical data quality rules that the MDM system can actually execute using our IDQ tool set. Fifth step is to identify the reference data to use with the business definitions and those data quality rules. So we saw the example earlier where we have state defined in our glossary. We also have a reference table of state codes. And so we want to then tie together the fact that our data quality rule is going to check to make sure that the state information coming in from those source systems matches one of the state codes in our reference table. The benefit of doing this in Axon is having a nice hierarchy of reference data that you can then look at from a business perspective and not have to actually look at reference data tables in your repository. So having this identified in Axon in a hierarchy format allows the business to then quickly search and have that at their fingertips to see what kind of reference data, and then also not only what the reference data is, but then what attributes are going to be using that reference data. After we've started to load data, or as we're starting to load the data, once we've moved it from our source systems to our MDM stage areas, and we want to create the master record, we need to identify the match rules and the trust scores that are going to be used. So we can use a policy facet because these are kind of rules, these are kind of policies that we want to apply to match the data. So this would be the combinations of attributes that we're using to match, whether we're doing fuzzy matching or exact matching. We would specify that in our match rule policies. And then once we have those defined, we can then define our trust score policies to say that we trust the data in system 1 over system 2 or system 3, or maybe I want just some of the attributes from system 1 are more trustworthy, but other attributes are more trustworthy from a different system. So we can set that up as a policy then also, and then tie those to our MDM 360 system. And then our MDM developers can take the business definitions of those match rules and trust score rules and actually create the code for that in our MDM system. And again, if we use our workflow to document that and send that around to everybody for approval, making sure everyone agrees that these are the combination of attributes that we want, these are the trust rules that we want, you know, this system is better than another system. We can capture all of that in that Axon workflow for the policy, and then it's easily referenced if we need to, if somebody challenges, well, why did we use that match rule, or why did we use that trust rule? At some point, we want to identify our householding and other relationships in MDM. So use the Axon glossary to glossary relationships to tie persons to organizations, persons to other persons, such as sons, daughters, parents, grandparents, etc. Professional relationships, such as financial consultants to the individual investors, and so on. And again, those glossary to glossary relationships, you can create a workflow to then have all the different stakeholders that are involved with that, make sure that they approve of doing a household or doing a person to organization relationship that way, and then you have that all documented. Our next step then is to identify the systems and integration techniques for consuming the mastered records. So once we have our mastered data, we can then share it with other systems. So we may be sharing it internally, and those internal systems will be owned by different business areas or different departments, or we could be sharing it externally with some third-party vendors, which are legal entities in our Axon model or our data governance model. And then again, our privacy regulations are typically interested in where that data not only resides internally, but also where that data is being shared. So we want to make sure that we attach geographies to those third-party legal entities. And again, as we design these interfaces and the systems, we're working with our IT teams to design the interfaces. So we'll use our workflow process in Axon, include those IT teams as the stakeholders, make sure that everyone is signing off on the technique that we're using to transfer the data out of MDM into those other systems, the frequency, the transfer protocols, whatever information we need to capture to design how those interfaces are going to work. We can design that in Axon and get our not only our business not only our MDM technical team, but also our IT interface team that develops the interfaces, get them to agree on the requirements. And then finally, because we are sharing data with external third parties potentially, we want to make sure that we identify the data sharing agreements, the masking rules, the other privacy policies and security measures that need to be used not only externally but also internally, as those MDM records are consumed. So again, we're going to use a policy facet for that, just like we did the match scores and the trust rules. This will be a different set of policies in a different hierarchy, so we can keep them separate from the match and trust rules. Okay, and then once we establish those policies, again, we'll use our workflow process to send it around to all the stakeholders, make sure that we've got all the right policies in place as we go through and share that information. So some additional best practices are to definitely take advantage of the workflow process in Axon, our data governance tool, so that we can document all the decisions, the discussions, the rejections, the approvals, and so on each one of the facets. So on the data domains, the glossaries, the source systems, the interfaces used to consume the master data, the different policies that we've created, the different data quality rules, and the different relationships such as the households or the business to consumer or business to business relationships. Okay, as each workflow process goes through the process, history is kept on each of the stakeholders' comments, approvals, rejections, and the timestamps, so we can then refer back to them in one place and find them easily, again, rather than searching through emails and decision documents or spreadsheets where we may have captured those decisions. So as I noted before in step 1, there are Axon accelerators available for this Customer 360 MDM data model. Those accelerators include bulk upload spreadsheets for the glossary definitions, for the glossary to glossary relationships. It also has all of the data sets for each table in the MDM model and all the attributes in each table in the MDM model. And then one system to represent the MDM system itself and tie everything together. And then the data sets and the attributes are already related to the glossary definitions, so you don't have to do that work. So all of this work is already available to you in those Axon accelerators, and then you just have to modify that in step 1 and step 2, determine which tables and attributes you're going to use. In step 2, determine if you aren't going to use any or some of them, or if you need to add additional ones or not. So that's available to us. All right, so let's take and do a demo right now of Axon, our data governance tool, and walk through each one of those steps. So step 1 and 2 were about defining your data domains and your elements, your fields that you want to master. Okay, so here you can see the example of the party hierarchy and how it breaks down into a party postal address, which then breaks down into different indicators, but eventually we get down to the actual postal address, which is open here. And we can see within that postal address, we have a line 1 through 5. We have a city, we have the state, we have the zip code. We can see that it has fields for resolution codes and coordinate systems and other information that's above and beyond our standard, street, city, state, zip. Okay. And as I said earlier in step 1 and 2, we can go through this model one by one and identify whether we want to use this information for the way that our company does business and whether we need to delete things or mark it as obsolete, or if we need to add something. So we'll have address information, social media information, phone information. Okay, so all of that is already loaded via those accelerators into the glossary for us to use. So if we go to the address, we can see the details of the address. And if we take a closer look at address line 1, we can also see that from our accelerator that we've also loaded the data. So if we go to the data tab, we can also see that it's loaded the data sets. So in our MDM C360 system, we have 2 data sets that have address line 1 in them. So the attribute name is address line 1 in both, but it's in a data set for postal address, and then property, the education table also has an address in it as well. So this is all tied together. So we're in the address line 1 glossary, but we can see the data sets and the attributes that are already associated with that glossary item. If we don't want an item, so say for example, we don't want the position designation field, all we have to do is come into Axon, go into edit mode, and we can change the Axon status to obsolete maybe before it's deleted. So maybe part of the workflow process is to start it off as obsolete, send it through the workflow process, and then once it's agreed that's not going to be used, then go ahead and have your data steward change it to delete it. But again, keep the definition in Axon, even though you're not going to actually use it in your MDM tables, because you want that documentation of why you decided to delete it and all the comments around that. So once we've got all of the glossary items identified, that next step, the third step, was to identify the systems, the source systems. So in this example, I have Salesforce.com, Marketo, and SalesLoft all feeding my MDM system. And then as I do this, I can then look at the glossary items that I'm going to be using for each of those systems. So in this case, I've only documented the MDM system at this point. Again, this is from the out-of-the-box data model, the accelerator. Not out of the box, but the accelerator that we can provide for Axon. And as you can see, there's 22 pages of attributes that are associated with our MDM system. Okay, and then as you identify your source systems, so for Salesforce, what data am I bringing from Salesforce? You would attach those glossary items. Maybe Marketo has a slightly different set of data that we're bringing over. You would attach those glossary items to Marketo. SalesLoft might have yet another set of data that I'm bringing over, so I would attach those glossary items. And so once you've identified your systems and the data attributes that you're going to be bringing over from those systems, you can then add those glossary items to each one of the systems, and it would display here when I do the glossary overlay on the system map. As we mentioned, we want to make sure that we have reference data, or excuse me, we want to make sure that we set up our data quality rules. So here you can see on the state glossary item. So I'm on the state glossary item. I've gone to my data quality tab, and I have a data quality rule for validity saying that state must be in the list of states in the states reference data table. Okay, so that's just one example of a data quality rule attached to state. You know, postal address or postal code, you would have your must be 5 digits or must be, you know, zip +4 rules. So you could specify all those data quality rules here. And then your IDQ developers can then take these data quality rules and apply, in this case, this would probably be an out-of-the-box data quality rule. Same thing with the postal code. But if you had anything unique to the way your company does business, they could take those data quality rule business definitions here in your data governance tool and then actually apply them in your data quality tool. We also mentioned reference data. So here you can see I have a hierarchy called reference data. And in this reference data hierarchy, you can see all kinds of different codes and different value lists and indicator lists and types that we would want to use with our data quality rules. So if I come down here to the S's, we can find state. Okay, and not only can I see that there's a state reference table, but I can also see what glossary items that state reference table is related to. So something in the organization table uses the state reference table, something in the property tax table uses it, and something in the postal address table uses state. So we can see everything that's related to that reference table. So instead of just going to the actual reference system and seeing just the reference tables and not knowing what's all using it, you can come to your data governance tool and not only see the hierarchy of reference tables, but also understand what other tables are using that reference data. And then we have our households. So here in a separate glossary hierarchy, we have our household of father, mother, son, grandfather, grandmother, and granddaughter. You know, if that's what suits the way your organization does business, this is the way we might want to set it up for like a cell phone company or an internet service provider, where there's a household of people that all use the same service, okay? And maybe it's paid for by one person in that household. So maybe the father and the mother pay for not only the home internet access, but maybe the son is off at one college and the daughter is off at a different college, and in their dorms they also have internet service, and those bills are coming back to the father and the mother. You know, maybe one of the grandparents is off at a nursing or care facility and has internet access, and that's also being paid for. So I want to know what the relationships are that are allowed for you know, like a friends and family type plan or something like that. Okay, if this was a health insurance household, you probably wouldn't see grandfather and grandmother, because our typical health insurance here in the United States only covers the parents and then just the children, the sons and the daughters, but not the grandparents. And then one of the final things we did was the consuming systems. Is we wanted to see what data, where the MDM data, once it's mastered, where it goes. So in this case, we've set up SurveyMonkey and our corporate data lake as two recipients of that master data. And then I also want to be able to do some overlays here of the policies. Okay, so as we do our mastering, we can see that we have a name, fuzzy, email, exact match rule. We have a name, fuzzy, zip, and email exact match rule. And then we also have a name, Salesforce is number 1 place to get the name from. Marketo would be number 2. SalesLoft would be number 3 as a trust rule. Okay. As we're sharing that information and applying other security measures to it, we can also see that for Salesforce.com, we have a security measure policy that says the data has to be encrypted at rest. Same policy down here on Marketo and also on SalesLoft. The Marketo and SalesLoft both have the encryption at rest policy on it. So does MDM. It also has an encryption at rest policy on it, as does our corporate data lake, encryption at rest. But our corporate data lake also has a 2-factor authentication policy on it, that you have to use 2-factor authentication in order to access it. You know, maybe other systems, the Marketo and Salesforce and MDM, maybe they are already under our single sign-on policy. And so we just have to do our single sign-on and then we can just directly go in. But maybe our corporate data lake isn't available to everybody via SSO. And so we want to have that separate 2-factor authentication policy on that corporate data lake to make sure we're securing that data as best we can. Now, as we transfer data out to SurveyMonkey, you can see that I don't really have any encryption or 2-factor authentication policies on the system itself. Those would be included in our data sharing agreements with the SurveyMonkey, but I do have some data transfer policies here. So for example, because I'm keeping information about the sons and daughters in the family, if those sons and daughters are under the age of 18, a lot of our privacy policies indicate that we can't share that information with third parties for marketing or surveying purposes. Okay, so in this case for SurveyMonkey, we have a child data do not share policy on it to make sure that as that interface that is moving the data from the MDM system to the SurveyMonkey system, we make sure that we aren't including any data where the date of birth indicates that they are under 18 years of age. Okay, we have another policy here that says for the account number, only show the last 4 digits. So while we need the account number in our survey so that the person receiving the survey can validate this is a legitimate survey by seeing the last 4 digits of their account number, we don't want to expose the entire account number to the SurveyMonkey company because that could lead to inappropriate use of that account. information. So we only want to share the last 4. So again, as that interface moves the data from the MDM system over to SurveyMonkey, we need to make sure that these policies are being applied to that data movement. That's the end of our demo, and that takes us to our questions and answer session.
Everyone, if you have any queries, please post them in the Q&A box. We'll try and answer them. Just wanted to call out that the recording for this session will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success Portal. From the Success Portal, you'll also be able to download the slide deck. And at the end of the session, there is a post-webinar survey that you can take, where you can let us know your feedbacks and suggestions for the upcoming topics, etc. We'd love to know from you.
All right, we have one question coming in asking if you have to use the Customer 360 data model in order to do this process. And the answer is no. If you already have another data model, or if you already have your Axon instance set up and you have a pretty strong glossary going already, we're just offering up the Customer 360 data model as a sample data model to gain inspiration from. So maybe there's some things in there that you didn't think about that you might want to add, but you don't have to use that Customer 360 data model, but you can take your existing glossary and then follow the rest of the steps when you're identifying the source systems, the consuming systems, the interfaces between those, the different policies, the match rules, the trust scores, the data sharing agreements, the legal entities, and the geographies. So you can use bits and pieces of this. You don't have to do every single step, but you can adapt this process for the way that you're currently set up to work and do your data governance in your MDM system. All right, we have another question that says, if you have Informatica MDM, does this automatically integrate? If you do not have Informatica MDM, does that mean you are loading the data through the integration? Now, that's a really good question. It's often, it's a very frequent question. And when you think about it, your Axon Data Governance tool is the business view of things. So it's more of a logical model, whereas your MDM instance is an actual physical model. So so Axon and MDM are not directly integrated. So if you make a change, if you mark something deleted in Axon, or if you add a new glossary definition that you want to use, or a set of glossary information that you want to use, it doesn't exactly update the physical model, because somebody still has to interpret that. You know, if I'm adding a whole set of definitions, what's the best way to model that from a data modeling perspective? So from a business perspective, it makes sense to have it all together. But maybe from a data modeling perspective, it actually makes sense to separate that information out into separate tables, because it's really a reference to something else, or that type of thing. So there is no physical link between the Axon instance and the MDM instance. And so therefore, even if you aren't using Informatica's MDM, if you're using someone else's, you can still use Axon to gather the requirements for your MDM system that you're using, because there's not that actual direct relationship. Let's see. The next question is, how complex is it to create new security rules, for example, the account last 4 digits? Is it coding or configuration? In this case, again, we're doing the business definition in Axon, okay, and then that can be interpreted by an IDQ developer to do the actual development. And then Sunil, can you speak a little bit more to the actual Axon IDQ integration that's available? So if I define something from a business perspective in a data quality rule in Axon, how does that actually translate to an IDQ rule?
Yeah, once you create the Axon the IDQ rule within the Axon, that will be connected to a scorecard or profiling which is created in the IDQ, which will give you a resolution or which will give you how that rule is applied and how the trend is across the data quality based on that rule. So you can see the trend, and you can see based on that rule that you created, you can adjust and make sure that the data is falling within the limits of acceptance or not. That is the main way of looking at it, the Axon rule applied against the data quality.
Okay, thanks, Sunil. The next question is this MDM and Axon collaboration working on IICS? And I think that when you say IICS, you're wondering if our MDM software as a service offering works with this Axon collaboration. And again, it does because there's no direct physical link between Axon and the MDM instance. Okay, so you can use it with our MDM on-premise and document your business requirements in Axon for your MDM implementation on-premise. And then you can also use Axon to document your requirements even if you're using our MDM software as a service. Okay, the next question is, can you explain how does EDC fit into this? Are you just loading the technical metadata? So one of the reasons I created these accelerators is at the time, this was developed about a year ago, EDC could scan the MDM model, but it didn't give you all of the information that you would get with a different EDC scan where it's a full-blown EDC scan. Okay, and so that's why I developed this accelerator where we actually took the physical data model and we actually mapped it one by one into the data sets and attributes. So that those data sets and attributes were the workaround for not being able to scan MDM with our EDC tool. Since then, since we developed this, they have made improvements to our EDC tool. So if you are using your MDM on-premise and you have your own instance of it, you can use the EDC tool to scan the MDM repository and load that data into Axon. And then obviously you would want to use your EDC tool to scan those source systems and the consuming systems and get that information into your Axon instance so that you can see that full data lineage. And you can also specify the interfaces and then make sure that as the data goes from the source system to the MDM system, that those policies and data quality rules are applied. And then as the data goes from the MDM to those consuming systems, that those quality and privacy rules are also applied in that way. So yeah, EDC definitely fits into the mix here. I just didn't pull it out in the presentation because I wanted to focus more on the Axon requirements gathering things. But you would use EDC to scan the source systems, get that metadata loaded. That will help you to identify what data items you want to bring over to your MDM as well. You can use the profiling in either IDQ or EDC to help you look at the source data and figure out what data you need. And then the same thing on the consuming system side. You would definitely want to scan those with EDC to get that metadata into Axon so you can see the lineage as you're going through. Another question is, are there any Axon free licenses we can use for demo purposes to integrate with MDM and to see the features? Not that I'm aware of, but definitely talk to your regional manager and to your account manager to see about, possibly setting up a pilot where we can provide an example of Axon and hook it up to your MDM system and see the features, using your company's way of doing business and the data that you want to use. I would definitely reach out to your account manager and see if something like that is possible as a pilot. Another question is the Axon IDQ connection also valid for CDQ? Sunil, do you have any information on the differences between IDQ and CDQ?
Yeah, I do not, but we'll get back to them on that specific question. Yeah, I just looked at it and trying to find that answer. We'll answer it later.
Okay, I didn't know if you might have more information. I do know that IDQ and CDQ are different animals. There's a lot that's shared between them, but there are differences. So like Camille said, we would have to check into this. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some differences. That's why I do not want to give a quick answer on that.
Okay. The next question is, for any change in MDM workflow rules model, should we first do the same in Axon and then in MDM? So keep in mind that the Axon workflow is all about a data governance workflow. It's about getting approval for, you know, the actual definitions, the actual trust rules, the actual match scores, the policies that you want to apply, the legal entities, the system source to target mappings, and so on. So the Axon workflow is all about the requirements and the data governance side. The MDM workflow rules are more about, okay, I've done my match, I have these mirror matches, they're not going to be automatic, they end up in a queue, you know, somebody has to work through those and actually figure out, you know, is this really a match, is this not a match? So those are a different kind of workflow, okay? So they're two separate kinds of workflows that we're talking about here, and one doesn't do the other. All right, another question that we have is, are you loading data into Axon for reference data like valid values? Can this be used by developers when building UI, since they would need to use the valid value set? So there's a whole white paper that's out on our I believe it's out on our Velocity site, and if not, we can share you the link to it, that talks about how to set up and use reference data across the Informatica products. So for Axon, we want the business definition saying, yeah, we want the reference data to include, you know, all of the 51 states, or if we're using the outlying areas, you know, whatever number that is. And so in Axon, rather than listing all 50 or 51 or 57 states, you would only put a representation of them in Axon, okay? Because you'd want the actual definition of that reference data to either be in our Reference 360 product, if you're using that, or in the tables that DQ can actually reference and MDM can actually reference. So there's the physical definition, and then there's the business definition. And Axon would have the business definition with just a sample of those values, and then the physical representation in either IDQ or Reference 360 would be the complete list. Okay, same thing for other values, other reference data. You would want to just give a sample of that information, just so that the person who's looking at the definition in Axon gets the gist of it. But the complete set of reference data would be either in your IDQ tables or in your Reference 360 tables.
Thank you, Lisa. There is another question from Sagar. Don't know if we have already answered that question. Question goes like this: is this MDM and Axon collaboration working on IICS?
Yeah, we talked about that. So again, by IICS, I assume they meant the software as a service version. And yes, the Axon collaboration works on both, again, because there's no physical connection between the two of them. So you can use it both ways with both on-premise MDM and our software as a service MDM.
Thank you, Lisa.
All right, so any more questions? I mean, this has been a great set of questions. So happy that you guys are engaged and asking questions. Any other questions before we go? We've got 6 more minutes.
Yeah, Lisa, I just want to see on that CDQ and IDQ connection. I haven't seen the Axon can connect to the CDQ directly. So only it can connect to the data quality as per the PAM.
Okay, good to know. But we can still define the business definition of the rule in Axon, and then get our CDQ developers as one of the stakeholders, get them involved in the workflow process to make sure that they agree that they can actually implement that in CDQ, but the implementation is, again, completely separate in CDQ than from Axon.
Yeah.
So they can look at the definition in Axon. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's still some collaboration there. It's not as direct a connection as with our IDQ product right now. But I would look to see that improving as time goes on and we make more improvements to our cloud offerings. One day I would envision that would be definitely a possibility.
Yeah, that is correct. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Neil, for researching that. Really appreciate it. All right, so it doesn't look like there's any more questions. Verinda, did you have anything else that you wanted to offer at the end here?
I think we are done with all the questions, Lisa. If we can wait for one more minute or so.
Okay.
If there are no questions, then we'll end this.
So while we're waiting for those additional questions, I can share another story from my past experience. I did do a recent MDM project last year with a major hospital system out on the West Coast. And unfortunately, in that case, we didn't have Axon at our disposal. And through the entire project, I just kept wishing that I had Axon to capture these requirements, because that's where we did have to go searching through emails, decision spreadsheets, meeting minutes, and so on, because we had it was a merger and acquisition. So there was a lot of back and forth between the two different companies that were merged. Each one wanted their own definitions and their own rules and their own way of doing things. So there was a lot of back and forth in that engagement on why things were decided a certain way, and no, I want to do it this way, and how come we didn't do it this way type of thing. And so that's where having Axon and having all of this requirements gathering and decision making documented in those workflow processes in the history would have been so useful. It would have saved us so much time from having to go back through emails, and you end up losing emails, you end up losing meeting minutes and things like that. So it would have just saved us so much time on that project had we had Axon available to our instance. Okay, so we got a couple more questions. So how exactly is the history of approvals documented in Axon? So if you're familiar with how Axon works, as you're working in a facet, you can do a change request. That change request then triggers the workflow process that's been set up for that facet. And that workflow process can be set up to have, different stages in it with different stakeholders. And then as the stakeholders process that change request, they can add their opinions. They can click the approve, they can click the reject button, give a reason. So all of that information is captured as part of that change request. So that when that workflow process ends, that change request is kept in history and you can go back and refer to it over time. Even if you start another change request on the same exact item, it still stores that as a historical change request, and it starts a new change request, which you can then add more information to, and then that gets stored and so on. So it basically, just keeps the history of all the change requests. Another question is, how do you determine what DQ
Yeah, there is a
rules...
question on the DQ rules, how they will be created.
Yeah.
It depends, right? Like, for example, the way Lisa presented in the presentation state code, it has to be in the reference table, and it has to have 2 characters. So those are the quality rules that you can define. Those rules are not like standard. It is based on the attribute and values that you are looking at it. You can add anything to that list. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, depending on how your company does business, say for example, when you share that information to downstream systems, maybe you have, the customer information and you have their name and their address and their phone and the email. But if you're just sharing that information for reporting and analytics purposes, do you really need the address and the phone and the email? Do you just need the person's name? Or maybe just something about that person that is more generic? And so, that's when you can decide, oh, I want a DQ rule that says when I, move this data from the MDM repository to that downstream system or to a file that's going to be picked up by, whatever process is picking it up, don't send the address, don't send the phone, don't send the email, take the name, but then obscure the name, maybe do a shuffle, keep it a female name, but not, or a male name, or maybe make it a generic name that's neither male or female. And just send that downstream. So again, it depends on how you do business, what the DQ rules are that you want to create. And again, there's a ton of out-of-the-box ones in data quality. So I would definitely start there and see if something already exists and then just reference that. Okay, and there is a place, if there is a standard, if you're using the on-premise IDQ tool, there is a place in the Axon definition where you specify the business definition, but then lower, you can actually pick out the actual IDQ rule, the technical rule that you're using to apply to it. Okay, but then you may have some custom DQ rules, such as don't send the address, phone number, and email, just send the name and then obscure the name in this way, type thing that you would have to then write your own for that. But once it's written in DQ, again, you can then attach that to the Axon definition as this is how it's technically implemented based on this business logic that we've described above. Okay, so we're over time. Any of the unanswered questions, we'll try and reach out and answer those to you.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa and Sunil, for the presentation and Q&A. Hope we have answered most of your queries. If we have failed to do so, we'll get back to you after the session. Thanks, everyone, for joining. See you on our next Tech Tuesdays. Bye.